3 episodes in, and we have watched the world end twice. We watched the Bronze Age trade network collapse in a single generation. We watched the Hittite Empire quietly pack its sacred statues and walk away from its capital. And each time we said, out of the ash, something new will grow. Tonight, we meet the something new. They called themselves the Canani. We know them as the Phoenicians, and what they did in the 4 centuries after the Bronze Age collapse is, I would argue, the most consequential story nobody tells. Because the Phoenicians did not just survive the collapse, they understood it. They looked at the ruins of every empire around them and drew exactly the right lesson. Power built on walls and armies is fragile. Power built on knowledge, on the ability to go everywhere, sell everything, and write it all down, is permanent. And then they acted on that lesson with a precision that still governs the world you live in today. After 1177 BC, the Mediterranean coast was a landscape of ruins and opportunity in equal measure. The great palace economies were gone. The trade routes they had controlled were abandoned. And sitting on a narrow strip of coast in what is now Lebanon, wedged between the mountains of the Lebanon Range and the sea, were a cluster of small Canaanite city-states that had weathered the storm. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad. These were not empires. They had no vast armies, no divine pharaohs, no 6-kilometer stone walls. What they had was boats, and a quality of purple dye that could not be produced anywhere else on Earth. The dye came from a sea snail, Murex brandaris, found along the Lebanese coast. Processing it was spectacularly unpleasant. The snails had to be crushed and left to putrefy in open vats for days, producing a smell so overpowering that Phoenician dye works were required by law to be built downwind of every city. But the color that emerged was unlike anything the ancient world could produce by other means. A deep, fast color, resistant to fading, that ranged from crimson to a blue-violet so dark it looked almost black in shadow. The Greeks called it Phonikes, the purple people, and so the Phoenicians got their name from the thing that made them rich. But purple dye was just the opening act. The Phoenicians grasped with unusual clarity that in the absence of empire, the sea was no longer a barrier. It was a road. Every coastal city the Bronze Age powers had controlled, every port, every market was now masterless. The Phoenicians did not need to conquer these places. They simply needed to show up with their ships, their dye, their cedar timber from the Lebanon mountains, and their extraordinary reputation for craftsmanship. And show up they did. Here is a fact that deserves a moment. King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred building in the Hebrew Bible, was built by a Phoenician architect with Phoenician cedar. The Book of Kings records it plainly. Solomon sent a message to Hiram, the king of Tyre, asking for skilled craftsmen and the famous timber of the Lebanon cedars. Hiram sent both. The pillars of the temple, the carved paneling, the great bronze castings in the forecourt, all Phoenician work. This was not unusual. Across the entire Near East in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, if you wanted the finest ivory carving, the finest metalwork, the finest glass, you hired a Phoenician. They were the master craftsmen of the post-collapse world. The old palace workshops were gone. The Phoenicians had inherited their techniques and their reputation. The Assyrian records describe Phoenician craftsmen working across the entire Near East. Ivory panels carved with such precision that modern curators struggle to identify the tool marks. Bronze bowls with inlaid scenes of hunting and feasting, copied by every neighboring culture for centuries. And glass. The Phoenicians were almost certainly responsible for the first production of genuinely clear glass. Not the cloudy, impure glass of the Bronze Age, but vessels transparent enough to show the liquid inside. Their workshops were the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. Everyone bought their products. Everyone tried to copy their methods. No one quite succeeded. But the Phoenicians' most extraordinary achievement was not what they made, it was where they went. Beginning around 900 BC, the Phoenicians undertook a systematic colonization of the entire Mediterranean basin. Not military colonization, they had no army large enough for that. Commercial colonization. They sailed west and kept sailing, planting trading posts at intervals of roughly a day's sailing along every coastline they touched. In Cyprus, they established Kition. In Sardinia, Sulci. In Sicily, Motia. On the coast of North Africa, they founded the city that would one day challenge Rome for control of the Western world, Carthage. And on the Atlantic coast of what is now southern Spain, at the edge of the known world, they founded a harbor they named Gadir. We still call it Cadiz. Think about what this required. These were relatively small merchant vessels, crewed by perhaps 20 men, and yet by 600 BC, Phoenician merchants were regularly sailing from the Lebanese coast to Spain and back, a round trip of over 5,000 nautical miles. The ancient historian Herodotus records, almost as a footnote, that Phoenician fleets circumnavigated Africa around 600 BC, commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II. The voyage took 3 years. They stopped each winter to plant grain on the African coast, harvested it, and sailed on. Herodotus himself says he does not believe it, but he also records the detail that makes modern scholars think it is true. The Phoenicians reported that as they rounded the southern tip of Africa, the sun was on their right, to the north, which is exactly what it would be south of the equator sailing west. They may have circumnavigated Africa 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama, the full continent mapped by Phoenician sailors in the 6th century BC, and then, because nobody wrote it down on clay, forgotten entirely, and nobody remembers. Of all the Phoenician colonies, the one that matters most is Carthage. Founded around 814 BC on the coast of modern-day Tunisia by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, led, the legend says, by a princess named Elisa, Carthage grew into something its founders could not have imagined, an empire. By the 4th century BC, Carthage controlled much of North Africa, Sardinia, western Sicily, and the southern coast of Spain. Its navy was the most powerful in the western Mediterranean. Its merchants traded as far north as Britain for the same tin the Bronze Age supply chain had once needed, still flowing to the same insatiable markets 3 centuries later. And then it met Rome. The general Hannibal Barca in the Second Punic War marched an army of 40,000 soldiers and 37 war elephants across the Alps in winter. Then he defeated Roman army after Roman army on Italian soil. For 15 years he was undefeated in the field. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, he encircled and destroyed 86,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. It remains one of the most studied tactical defeats in military history, studied by Napoleon, Patton, Rommel. Every general who came after him went to school on Cannae. And yet, Carthage lost. His supply lines were too long. The reinforcements never arrived. Rome, unlike its opponents, simply refused to accept that it had been beaten. In 146 BC, a Roman army under Scipio Aemilianus razed Carthage to the ground. The ancient sources say the city burned for 17 days. Its libraries were destroyed or dispersed. Its language, a dialect of Phoenician still spoken across North Africa, died within a generation. Its gods were absorbed or renamed. Its very site was left uninhabited for over a century, as if Rome needed to be certain nothing would grow back. The Phoenician world had found its absolute limit. The one thing it had never developed, the one thing its trading philosophy had never required, a professional standing army capable of sustaining total war across an entire peninsula. Commerce can build everything except that. But here is what Rome could not destroy. Around 1050 BC, in the century after the Bronze Age collapse, when the old palace writing systems had died along with the palaces that maintained them, Phoenician merchants developed a new writing system. Not cuneiform, which required years of specialist training, not Egyptian hieroglyphics, the exclusive property of the priestly class. Something radically different. An alphabet of 22 consonants. No vowels, no pictograms, just 22 signs, each representing a single sound that could be combined to write any word in any language a human throat could produce. A child could learn it in days. A merchant could scratch it onto a pottery shard in the field. It was the most democratic writing system ever invented, and it was designed from its first principles for trade. The Phoenicians spread the alphabet wherever they sailed, and everywhere it landed, it was adapted. The Greeks received it around the 9th century BC. They added vowels. Semitic languages can be read from consonants alone, but Greek cannot, and called the result their own. The Romans adapted the Greek version and added letters. The result was the Latin alphabet. The letters you are reading right now, A, B, C, D, are the direct descendants of Phoenician trade signs. The letter A was originally Aleph, meaning ox, because it looked like an upside-down ox head. The letter B was Beth, meaning house. The first two letters of the Phoenician alphabet, Aleph and Beth, became the Greek Alpha and Beta, which gave us the word alphabet. Every email you have ever written, every book you have ever read, every law written in any European language, every scientific paper, every religious text in the Western tradition, all of it flows from those 22 consonants, scratched by a merchant's hand in the ruins of the Bronze Age world. The Phoenicians did not build the biggest empire. They did not leave the most impressive ruins. What they left was a technology so simple and so powerful that every civilization it touched immediately adopted it and never let go. That is a different kind of immortality. The Phoenicians took more than their alphabet wherever they sailed. They took their gods. The Phoenician pantheon, headed by the storm god Baal, the goddess Astarte, and the city god Melqart of Tyre, spread across every colony in the Mediterranean. Melqart was a god of the sea and commerce, a protector of sailors. By the time his cult reached the Greeks in the Western Mediterranean, he had merged with the greatest hero in Greek mythology, Heracles. When Rome absorbed the Greek tradition, Heracles became Hercules. The Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, were originally called the Pillars of Melqart. The Phoenicians planted his symbol at the edge of their world as a declaration. We went this far, and we went further. The goddess Astarte, love, war, the evening star, was absorbed into Greek tradition as Aphrodite. Her symbol, the planet Venus, is still used in modern biology to denote the female sex. And the story of the Princess Elisa, Dido, fleeing Tyre with a band of followers, arriving on the African coast and using a legal trick to claim more land than her enemies had agreed to, became, in Virgil's hands, one of the most famous love stories in Western literature. Dido and Aeneas, a Phoenician queen and a Trojan hero. Two survivors of the Bronze Age meeting at the edge of the New World. Even in mythology, the Phoenicians and the world of Troy are tangled together. If the Phoenicians were this consequential, if they gave us the alphabet, colonized the Mediterranean, circumnavigated Africa, built Carthage, and shaped Western mythology, why does almost nobody know their story? The Phoenicians wrote on papyrus and wood, not on clay. Their records, the ship's logs, the trade accounts, the histories they certainly kept, are gone. Organic materials do not survive 3,000 years in the coastal Mediterranean climate. The Hittites wrote on clay. We have 30,000 tablets. The Egyptians carved in stone. We have the temple walls. The Phoenicians wrote on material that rots, in a world that burned their greatest city and destroyed the rest. What we know about the Phoenicians we know almost entirely from their enemies, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans. And those sources describe the Phoenicians through the lens of rivalry or contempt. The Greeks called them cunning. The Romans called them perfidious. The Bible describes the Phoenician princess Jezebel as the archetype of the wicked foreign woman. History was written by those who won. The Phoenicians lost, not in trade, not in navigation, not in cultural influence, but in the final brutal contest of military power. And so their story was told by the people who defeated them, written in a script the Phoenicians invented, propagated through a commercial network the Phoenicians built, expressed in alphabets that carry in every letter the ghost of a Phoenician merchant's hand. Their erasers used their tools. There is something almost perfectly ironic about that. The full inventory of what the Phoenicians left behind, the alphabet, and through it every system of writing in the Western world, including Arabic and Hebrew, which descended directly from the Phoenician script, the navigational knowledge that underpinned the age of exploration, Phoenician ship routes refined across 4 centuries of commercial voyaging became the foundational charts that later Mediterranean sailors inherited without ever knowing their source. The city of Carthage, which forced Rome to become an empire rather than a city-state, because you cannot be a city-state when you are fighting Hannibal Barca. The myths of Heracles, Aphrodite, and Dido, which shaped Greek and Roman religion, literature, and art. The cedar timber of Lebanon, which built not only Solomon's temple, but the fleets of Egypt and the palaces of Assyria. And perhaps most strangely, the name of an entire continent. Europa, in Greek mythology, was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of the king of Sidon, who was carried off across the sea by Zeus in the form of a bull. The Greeks used her name for the lands to the west. The continent of Europe is named after a Phoenician girl. We began this series in the ruins of the Bronze Age. We watched the most sophisticated civilization of the ancient world collapse under the weight of its own complexity, and questioned, what survives? The answer has been consistent across 4 episodes. Not the walls, not the palaces, not the armies or the kings or the divine hierarchies. What survives is the useful thing, the portable thing, the idea simple enough to be carried in a single human mind, written on a single piece of papyrus. The Hittites left us their myths and their legal structures, embedded in the cultures that came after them. The Phoenicians left us the very tool with which all subsequent civilization would record itself. The Bronze Age ended. The Phoenicians, the purple people from the narrow coast of Lebanon, gave the New World the means to record its own story. 4 episodes in, and the pattern is clear. Every civilization in this series fell for the same reason. It built its power on something it could not carry. Bronze required a supply chain spanning continents. The Hittite Empire required a vassal network that held only as long as every node cooperated. Carthage required trade routes it could not defend against a land army that did not care about trade. The Phoenicians lasted longer than any of them, not as an empire, but as an idea, because what they carried was weightus, 22 symbols, a ship, and the knowledge that the sea goes everywhere. Next episode, we follow the alphabet north and west into the hands of a people who will use it to invent something the ancient world had never seen: democracy, philosophy, tragedy, and the concept of the individual human being as a subject of history. The Greeks are coming, and they bring questions that have never been answered. I'm your host. This has been the Midnight Storyteller. The story is just beginning. Good night.